All right, and we are live. Damien, how you doing, my friend?
I'm good. Yet another funny day in the Magento ecosystem.
It's a funny day. Unfortunately, we don't have video for you, but we trust that you are looking well today. We ran into
Oh,
some.
I think I'm looking
I think
fine.
you're looking fantastic. I don't know for sure, but I'm sure. I'm certain. I can't see it, but I believe by faith that you're looking great.
I believe that some people would swipe right.
I I believe that I believe that a significant portion of the dating market would swipe right, quick,
Nice.
fastly, and furiously. But that's not what we're talking about today because what are we talking about today, man? There's a lot going on with obviously Magento with the fork. I was gonna say the flag with the fork, which is not necessarily a fork.
Pitchforks.
The pitchforks, the Russian hackers, and maybe just generally catch up with what you've been up to. But I read the post that you wrote on the lol tweet, which when I first read the lol, I thought Max was making fun of the fork at first, and I
Oh
was
yeah.
like, why is he making fun of the fork like that? That's not cool, because I'm generally pro fork. But then I reread it and understood he was actually sort of making fun of Adobe's response, which was kind of savage. I thought a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
it was. It was indeed savage. I got a good kick out of it when I read it.
Anyway, let's dive in, man. What are your thoughts on the whole situation? Did you get a chance to watch? Because I didn't. But they're having a conference in Poland right now. They've been talking about it. There's task forces. There's a task force. That's a hard word to say for some reason. That's been created. There's stuff going on. There was a panel. I didn't catch it all. But did you get a chance to see any of that?
Yeah, I watched through, I think, the first hour and so, like hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes. I didn't really catch the tail end of it, but I did watch it. Um, the the Meet Magento Poland group, it was some people from Typo 3, some people from the Magento Association, and then obviously Vinay and Willem. Um, I think, well, I have a strong opinion on the Magento Association. And in terms of to fork or not to fork, I believe, my personal opinion is I don't think forking is the correct answer. Um, but I think we'll get to that explanation. Uh, well, it depends. Do you want to talk about the Magento Association or the fork first, I
Let's
guess?
talk about the fork. Let's get the forking
Okay.
discussion of the fork out of the way.
Sure. I think so Greycore and our team serves, I think, a different cross section of the Magento ecosystem than I think Vinay and Willem do. Huva is a very, very awesome front end if you are doing monolithic front end, right?
Right,
It's there's no why would you pick Luma? Like
right,
it's just a mistake. The license fee isn't high enough, and even you're gonna save tens to hundreds of hours up front just by picking Hoover. Your cost is gonna be insane, or your cost reduction is gonna be crazy in comparison.
right.
So there's no reason not to do Hoover. Um, but I see a different niche of the Magento ecosystem. We tend to work with larger merchants that are doing bigger things. They have, it's not just one Magento front end. We have several clients that have 15 individual store views, each one with a different front end. And they have big problems, right? The problem set that they have is very different than the problem set that a small, medium, or an SMB merchant would have.
Hmm.
And my opinion is that uh, the fork is bad because it fragments the ecosystem. But at the same time, I think the fork it has got some positives because it shines a light on what has now been a long, underserved portion of the community. And I say long underserved because there was a point in time where that was the only community, like small merchants in Magento was the origin of Magento. It wasn't just big enterprises.
Right.
And I think the fork is good because it shines a light on the problem. I think the concept of actually keeping a fork is not necessarily the right decision. That being said, if the fork really goes through and it's done well, I think it's a powerful thing, and I would hope that Adobe backs it because I don't see any reason why you wouldn't. I mean, you can maybe call it something other than Magento, but Adobe open source commerce, I don't know, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But I would hope that they would back it and support it.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean,
but I don't necessarily think upfront it's the best decision.
Yeah, I mean, and I think they've said themselves that it's not necessarily going to be a fork. It's like there's a couple ways that this could play out. I mean, it sounds to me like basically, there's a lot of people that like the monolith. It works for them. And whose article was it? Oh, I read Mark Schust's article on it, and he references a post by Signal versus Noise by the Basecamp guys by DHH on the majestic monolith. So I'm gonna use that term, the majestic Magento monolith.
Yeah, I get it.
And so they there's a huge user base for it. They want, some way to maintain that. Maybe that's ideally under the official, maybe that's under, maybe that's the primary Magento open source project. There doesn't have to be a fork. Though I feel like what's happening is that, the Magento community is sort of saying, hey, we've been telling you guys forever that, there's issues, whether that's things not getting merged, into GitHub, problems not getting resolved, or this move to microservices or whatever it is. And it's just like, they're kind of like, hey, we're just going to do this ourselves. Like, we're kind of like, I don't know what the deal is with the association. Obviously I have friends that are on the association. I don't want to be overly critical. At the same time, it feels to me like basically, and I don't know, and I'm not privy to any of the internal machinations, but my assumption is just that they're essentially sort of just waiting for approvals from Adobe. Like maybe I don't know, like they maybe they ask for something and then they just wait for an approval. And like that, in some ways the community's been waiting for things to kind of get better for years now. And they're just like, all right, we're kind of just done, done waiting. And I like that. I think that I look at what Willem did with Huva, and, he basically took a chunk of Magento, right? Just it doesn't solve every problem for everybody. He took the front end for certain use cases, which I'd say is a relatively broad set of use cases. He reimagined it as a single dude, more or less as a single guy, and he's building out a team and stuff. And he built out something that people love to work with. Like at first I thought it was just a fun little project of his, and then I'm hearing from people in the wild going like, oh man, I'm actually enjoying development again. I'm enjoying my day job again. And when I talk to him, just the amount of excitement and energy he has around really, giving Magento kind of like a lifetime beyond just making it sort of fun and to work with and stuff like that. I think that, if they want to attack the rest of other aspects of it, right, the rest of the monolith and stuff like that, I just feel like they can pull that off,
That's a really loaded answer, because there's so much difference between splitting out a front end,
right,
in the way that it's been done in tackling the monolith, because the monolith is it is exactly what it is. It's immense. It is a massive project that has so many facets and has had hundreds, if not thousands, of developers, each with different experiences, putting work into it. That I struggle to imagine what that might look like if it was just Willem. Like I know everyone, a couple of people in the community have been saying like Willem for God King.
BDFL.
You know, yeah, yeah, and I even though I say that I myself am the BDFL of Daffodil, it's not the same thing. They're different things. The market size of Magento is immense comparatively. So they're very different things. I serve a much smaller use case, and that would be a massive undertaking. Now, that being said, I want to kind of speak back to something you mentioned about just the general community feel with waiting for approval. Then I mentioned it this morning about how if it was somewhat kind of hinted at that we could remove our shackles and get back to work. And we can spend a significant amount of time doing engineering and development and less time worrying about I don't even know what those approvals are waiting on, but I'd imagine it's some business use cases that have to be validated and tested and verified. Right. And that slows everything down. And Vinay's like, we can do things in a much shorter period of time, and as evidence, Huva, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, just to kind of bring those two concepts back together, if someone tries to attempt the monolith or attempt to maintain the monolith in the way that I think we all kind of experience open source, which is, I submit a PR, and a couple of days from then I get a review, and then maybe it gets merged, or I get some comments, and then it all gets done in the span of 2 weeks. I don't think that's realistic. I don't, if you consider Kubernetes, or if you consider Angular or the Linux kernel, all these things take time. You're not going to get short merges, right? There's a whole process in place. Now, Linux is a little bit different because it doesn't use the same kinds of workflows. It does patches over email and things. But I think it's an undertaking that I don't necessarily think that we, the open source community, have an understanding of the scale of it. Like it's massive.
Yeah, no, that's a fair critique. I mean, it is a leap, right, to go from like some greenfield development on a new front end framework to that has had some success, to saying like, oh yeah, like let's tackle the entire Magento project along a similar vein. It is a leap for sure, but and there's no guarantees this is going to work out. I mean, it's entirely possible that it wouldn't work at all, and nobody can tell the future. But I just I don't know. I mean, an analogy, and this is not a perfect analogy either, but I remember back when I was in house with as a developer with a merchant, and we were on enterprise, and I just talked to someone just the other day who was in a very similar situation in house with a merchant that's on enterprise, and who essentially gets zero support from customer support on enterprise, and they I remember like I filed a ticket, and at the same time I posted a question to Stack Overflow. I just did them both at the same time to see what would happen, and the Stack Overflow like question was answered within like 24 minutes and the enterprise ticket was responded to like 3 days later with like like a not very thorough response kind of thing. So again, not a perfect analogy, but I really, I don't know. I just believe that that it can be possible for the community to really run this. I think back sort of before, I don't know when, but like back in the day, like the community would build out extensions for all sorts of things and solve all sorts of problems and stuff like that. And this was before Magento was even on GitHub properly, and it's sort of just the community kind of self-managed a lot of stuff and did a lot of cool stuff. And, and then we sort of thought that everything was going to be great once it was on GitHub. And a lot of things I think they did were really smart, like the incentive program for solutions partners to contribute. But then it's weird. It's almost like, even though I think that they did that in the right spirit and it seemed like a really smart thing to me to do, it kind of went a weird direction where like people were just contributing so that they could be at the top of the leaderboards and things like that. And it I don't know. It seems like it did something weird to what was previously kind of a pure contribution model in some sense. And so I don't know, like you could be completely right that this is way too much to bite off and that response times and merge times might get much worse. But I'm just kind of like, hey man, let's see where this thing goes,
Oh yeah.
And I don't have that much skin in the game personally, so that should be taken with a grain of salt. But I think a lot of people that, that are working on this do have a lot of skin in the game in terms of clients they're working with and things like that. And you definitely fall into that category. So it'll be interesting to see what happens for sure.
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible, but I can say for a fact the management structure of it is going to be vastly different than what exists today with Adobe, where I don't know if when was like the last time you submitted a PR?
Oh my gosh,
to Magenta?
It's been a very long time. It's been a very, very long time. Yeah.
So in my article that I kind of hinted at to Igor, I point out that PR wait times are immense. They're just crazy. I have several GitHub issues. They're not PRs, just issues. I'll give an example of a PR as well, where I submit it and they have installed like a issue tracker bot, and the issue tracker bot will just close my issue after 90 days with no response. So, I mean, I'll submit an issue that I can actually like reference the line of code and say, here's the issue. This is what needs to be changed. Please change for these reasons. Closing because, closing for inactivity. What am I supposed to do with that? Right? And there are examples of PR. No, they don't do that to PRs, but they do it to GitHub issues. And for my PRs, I've had PRs I think that are out for, I don't know, a year and a half now, where no one has looked at them.
It's just absurd. Like yeah.
So I think the management structure today, as I kind of understand it, is that there are several different teams, and the teams triage, as they can. But their main prerogative is not to triage. Their main prerogative is to do their work and then triage as they can. I think we're going to need to see something more. The structure of this forecast to be more about code ownership, where you have individual code owners of particular subfolders, and a code owner can sign off on their own code, and they can sign off on targets to those folders, and they can merge stuff faster. But you don't need, like, Vellum doesn't have to merge and approve every single PR, right? You can have people who have a specialty in one specific, like, I have a couple of PRs that are targeted solely to RabbitMQ, right? That's kind of something that I spent earlier last year making some improvements on for some of my clients. I could probably review that code. Like I don't know if Vellum even knows how the RabbitMQ stuff works.
Right.
But that would be something that I could review, and maybe we could have like code owners that say, okay, well, this folder is reviewable by these people, and it's like maybe a set of 50 people.
Totally.
And that would broaden the ability for review beyond arbitrarily waiting for someone at Magento to review it and hoping that it could get merged.
Totally.
Now, the problem with that is in the fact that Magento has like an architecture repository, and I'm subscribed to it, and I get notifications whenever someone submits a PR or an issue. That is there to prevent poor decision making, right? Because you can very easily have a bunch of code owners sign off on a PR and say, okay, we think this looks good, but not understand the broader ramifications to other aspects of the framework. And you have to try and prevent those. So the architecture repo is designed to try and get some early, especially if you have to make a fairly large change, to get some early review or understanding, as opposed to just submitting a PR and kind of hoping for the best. And maybe, okay, the test pass, hooray.
Right.
That doesn't mean necessarily that it's best in the best interest of the system as a whole.
Right. Right.
So I think to kind of summarize, I think if they're going to succeed, they're going to need to have a vastly different managerial structure for code review and architecture review and maintenance than exists today.
Right.
And even if Adobe wanted to do it, whichever party, Vinay and Willem or Adobe, one of them it's going to have to change in both cases.
Right.
For it to succeed.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that it comes back to ownership so much. And I know there are tremendously talented and smart devs and architects on the Adobe side. That goes without saying. But I just think that it's an incentive structure thing, right? When you aren't the person that is going to be impacted by that PR issue that's sitting there 90 days or a year, and your internal incentives are X, Y, and Z based on whatever the corporate incentives are for you to get a raise or get whatever, you're going to pay attention to those. And whereas I'm a big believer in what a single person can do, a small team can do when they know what they're doing, they care about the thing that they're working on, and they have that sense of ownership. That's what I see in people like you. I mean, you have Daffodil is your, open source project that you run. I think about what, Willem has done. And with Huva on a smaller scale, and tons of people, right? That there's something that they care about, and it's part of their day-to-day work, and they just, they get it done. You can get a lot done as a small team if you are kind of things are structured in the right way. You get stuff done, right? You keep it simple. You keep things moving. You got the right people in the right places. And then it's like Mythical Man Month, right? You could have 100, great developers, but if they're in some kind of a weird structure that isn't prioritizing the stuff that needs to get prioritized, then, you could just have, really, kind of a really unproductive system overall. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely true. Mythical Man Month definitely applies here. There is so much inefficiency in corporate structure that I'm surprised anything from the community gets merged, to be honest. Then the sad thing is, I'm going to take that one step back and say, I'm surprised anything that goes beyond the boundary of solution partner developer gets merged, because they have an incentive, right? There's probably contractual obligation in place to say, hey, solution partners contributed PRs, you have to review them. Otherwise, we have some kind of contractual obligation. But if, random open source dev, a great case is if Ivan submits a PR and Ivan's PR is fantastic, I doubt it's going to get reviewed.
Right.
Right. It's just not.
Right.
Because there's no incentive to do so.
Right.
And that's you made a really good comment with the concept of the solution partner incentive program. If anything, that makes me feel as an open source dev less inclined to contribute, because there are people who I don't know, I don't necessarily know if there's any other incentives to the actual partner organization, or if they get any special credits or things for submitting PRs. But I'd imagine there's probably something. As an open source dev, I do the same thing to no result. So now you've now split the class of developers into two: people who get kickbacks and people who don't.
Right.
And the people who don't are wonder, wait, why am I not getting kickbacks? What am I doing that's not right? I'm doing the same kind of work.
It's just really strange, because I swear I thought that the contribution program was brilliant. I thought it made a lot of sense. And then I saw people, companies that I knew and respected that were just diving in and throwing resources into the program and going up the leaderboards. And I was like, this is amazing. But then as I talked to some of them, it seemed like and I can't remember the details, but I did some interviews with some of them, and it was like, they were doing this contribution, sort of trying to get certain goals or accomplishments or whatever incentives, and then it sort of just at some point was like, this doesn't make sense, or we're just going to focus elsewhere, which just seemed kind of strange to me. And like prior to all those incentive programs, like everybody just kind of contributed. Everybody built out their own little modules, and then they would, gain in popularity if they were useful. And then everybody would like give them props because they built the thing, and it was just great. Like, and at the time we all wanted everything to be in GitHub so all our contributions could go to one place. But, then we got that, and then it's like, I don't know. It just, it's not quite it.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me about Magento versus the other open source projects that I contribute to is that I think Magento is pseudo open source, right? The decisions don't happen in transparent environments. The decision happens behind closed doors, and then you are either privy to that information because you have a contact at Adobe,
right,
or you happen to know somebody who knows somebody,
right,
or you're left in the dark until release day.
Right.
Or you happen to go, if you're a really, really proficient developer, you're looking at every single PR that gets merged to understand what's happening when, where, and why, and by whom. And that's hard, right? That's a full-time day job. Like if someone wanted to be the town crier for Magento and say, hey, PR was merged, these are the ramifications, that doesn't exist, and that would be a full-time day job.
Right.
But yeah, it feels like Magento as a framework is open source only in name, but not in actuality.
Yeah.
And if I compare that to Angular, Angular is somewhat similar because a lot of that stuff happens behind closed doors at Google, but they at least have RFC periods which are really, really, really pronounced. Like they make a big deal about it. They post it on everywhere, and everyone knows about it, and people comment about things. Like a really great example is, and I don't want to dive too far off of Magento, but Angular about last year or the year prior changed their underlying renderer, right? The thing that takes your component and turns it into HTML. That went from V2 to V3, which, if not done correctly, would have been a Magento 1 to Magento 2 like problem. But they spent 4 years working on it and had tons and tons and tons of RFCs and talked to a whole bunch of people in the community, had people beta test the versions of the new render, and it went smoothly. Compare that to, I can reference Magento 1 to Magento 2. I know there was a beta for Magento 2, but I didn't know about it until Magento 2.1. So as I said, they're both frameworks, Angular and Magento, for me are partially or open. They're both open source, but one is more open source than the other. And then if you kind of compare this to like Kubernetes, this is another Google thing, similar kind of thing. It's technically now has a completely open source steering committee. It's completely different than when it was originally at Google, but after it became open source, they put this whole infrastructure in place to steer it in an open source capacity. That's just not true with Magento whatsoever. There's no steering committee. I think I made the commentary in my article that the Magento Association is a wet noodle of an organization. They're not the steering committee.
Yeah.
Igor is the steering committee. Igor and the architects at Adobe are the steering committee,
right,
and they make the big decisions,
right,
but they make the decisions outside of the scope of the open source community without any consideration to anybody else.
Right.
And that's the difference.
And I don't know. I think a lot of people have been like, what's the Magenta Association going to do? Is it doing events? I think events were a big component of it. Is it going to take over open source? I think that's been kind of a persistent question. And obviously I have a lot of friends that are on the association, and I feel bad being critical. I mean, you called it a wet noodle, but
Well, I don't feel like that's too critical.
yeah. Well, and I guess it sort of depends from what the expectation is, right? Like if the expectation is that it's an organization that's doing events, then that probably wouldn't be reasonable to criticize them for the code level stuff, right? But the question is, I mean, this is an open source project, and like there should be some kind of governance of that, right? Like what is the thing that owns open source? And I think if the expectation is that it should be the Magenta Association, which I think is a reasonable sort of point of view, then you're right, because then it's like, well, I assume, and again, I don't know any of this, but I just assume that maybe they've asked, like, hey, like what's going on with all these issues and all these wait times and all these complaints by the community, and I'm assuming Adobe was like, well, we'll see what we can do, we'll try to fix it. But it's kind of just been in this weird state of like purgatory, where it's like, well, what's going to happen? Is anything going to happen? And then it's just finally like people are just like, uprising, it's just like, we're just
I mean, it's a frustrating situation because, when I heard about the Magento Association, my very first inclination was like, this is great, right? As a Magento 1 dev, I didn't really feel a connection to the Magento community. Obviously I would go on Stack Overflow, or I was part of IRC, and that's kind of like where my boundary and entry to the Magento community stopped. Mm-hmm. With Magento 2, the Slack channel for me has been a godsend because I am super active in the community engineering Slack. I respond to basically everybody that I see that I think has a legitimate question. Mm-hmm. Not to say that I don't respond to illegitimate questions, but there are times when I just don't have the bandwidth. And I didn't do that previously. Mm-hmm. So when the Magento Association became kind of more known about and became this thing that Adobe's going to try and put forward, I was like, okay, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. Like, this is going to be people who I can talk to and be engaged with, and they will maybe help navigate or help direct the open source community in a more kind of coordinated manner. Right. Didn't get that at all. I got nothing from that. Like as I said in my article, the only thing that I found was an email from time to time notifying me that there were some events. Right. And I did see that they're saying that we're putting together this open source task force. Cool. What's it do?
What is a task force?
Tell me, like you don't tell me anything about what you're doing. Yeah. Like, are you trying to decide what features to put together, or is this a meeting to have a meeting? I
don't have a lot of faith in anything that's referred to as a task force, generally speaking. I was again hesitant to be critical, but I saw Yissi just posted an article, and he said some similar things about the task force. I mean, I kind of just I get excited when I see people doing stuff. At the end of the day, mm-hmm. It's sort of what it comes down to. Now, can you, I mean, it's good to have organization and management and stuff like that too. But personally, if I see somebody build something, that's what I like to see, right? When you're talking about nuts and bolts about, hey, listen, I can help out with message queue stuff. I know that part of the system. Like, send me stuff. I will handle it. I'll review it. All right. Like, that's the kind of stuff I like to see actual stuff get done. And I'm just kind of a little bit biased in that direction. So when I see Hoover getting built out, when I see, people just actually doing stuff, that's kind of, I'm saying the same thing over and over, but you get, you kinda,
I get it. I get it. Yeah. There's a difference between just kind of talk and action. Yeah. Right. And Vinay spoke to this precisely. He said, this is, I want to do something. I need, there's so much energy in the community. We wrote a letter and all of a sudden there's all this Magento energy
Yeah.
filled the room. It
Right.
filled the vacancy.
Right.
So Vinay described it as a Magento-sized hole
Right.
in
Right.
the ecosystem. And he's perfectly correct. Like there is tons and tons of great energy. Like the fact that, to me at least, the fact that Yissa isn't on the Magento Association um, blows my mind.
Hmm.
The fact that you or Phil um, aren't on the Magento Association blows my mind because these are the people that the community is aware of. Like
Right.
you said that you have some friends on the association. Personally, as an open source dev, I have never seen or met a single one of them.
Right.
Not to
Well,
say that they're not good people.
yeah. I mean, I think, like for example, I saw Danny Verkady. I think he's out in Poland, and I think he talked about some things and is part of the task force. I mean, he's a guy that has built out an agency. I mean, he's a guy that gets stuff done. And Slava, with Atwix, built out a tremendous agency. But I think that I don't. I think that it's just the association. It's like Guido was on the association, right? He just recently stepped down, and he's also a guy that gets stuff done. I mean, he launched the biggest Magento community in the world in the Netherlands early days, and done a bunch of other stuff. But I don't know what is going on in the association, and also I have not responded to all of the requests for different things. Or I always feel guilty, like I should be somehow doing more. But I don't know what is going on in the association. I assume that they're generally just kind of doing the best they can, wanting to contribute, doing more than I'm doing in terms of they're in the association. But I assume they're probably just waiting for Adobe's approval on different things, and probably just kind of there's not a whole lot they can do, I assume.
That's not a problem that I was aware of. I guess I assumed they operated to some degree independently. But in the event they are somewhat hamstringed by Adobe, I can imagine that that would be tremendously frustrating. And I believe Sava this morning said, we're all just people. Please don't hate us or something to that effect.
Right.
And that's absolutely true. Like everyone is human. But the expectations that we have are high, right? Because in
Right.
many instances, people's businesses depend upon these things, right? And if Magento goes a certain route, and this is very apparent to me that Huva needs Magento. Magento does not necessarily need Huva. So it is in Willem and Vinay's best interest to make sure the monolith remains. Now, that's a very single-sided point of view. It also has other ramifications, but it's clear to me that it has to exist. They're doing this because that protects their livelihood, and that's a perfectly reasonable reason to do something, right? It makes great sense. But at the same time, and maybe this is the crux of the problem with the association, if they're hamstrung and they can't do anything, what does the community do? Like maybe, and this is the point of the fork, we're just going to do it ourselves. We have to do it ourselves. There's no other option.
I think so. I mean, to me, that's what it's all about. Is just the community going, hey, we're going to do this ourselves, whatever that looks like. In an ideal world, the association gets formal ownership over the code base, right? And there's an independent organization that actually runs the code base. Is that the case now? I don't think so. I mean, I know people have asked, like, is the association going to own the open source code base? I know that question's been asked. I don't know there's been an answer. I feel like people have said something to the effect of like, maybe. And I feel like that's probably one of the things that maybe they've just been waiting for. I'm just guessing. I could be completely wrong about this. But yeah, I mean, that'd be cool if that could happen. And then the association could have some like real stuff to do, But yeah, it's
However that happens, there's got to be a tremendous amount of funding for it. Because if you're going to run Magento full time, that's not a thing you do volunteer. That's a thing that's a full-time job. And much like Evan You has to maintain Vue.js and he gets donations and they support him,
Mhm.
that has to happen. The weird e-commerce is a weird world because I am fully conscious of the fact that people are making tremendous amounts of money off of my code.
Right.
And am I compensated equivalently to the benefit that I provide? Not necessarily.
Not exactly.
So I'm very surprised, just generally speaking, that e-commerce does not have a higher donation ratio than other communities. My only two sponsors on GitHub are people who I have helped in the community who are individual developers working for companies. They could not persuade their company to sponsor me, so they, because of the sheer amount of help that I provided, they sponsored me themselves.
Wow.
So I think, however it happens, this fork is gonna need funding. The association's gonna need funding in order to run this well.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like why like the Linux Foundation exists. It's why the Cloud Native Computing Foundation exists. There's got to be capital to run the projects.
Yeah.
Because they're hard to run.
Yeah. What did they say today during the meeting? Did you, other than the task force, was there anything concrete?
There were some things. There were some very funny gotchas. Like the Typo 3 guys were rather clever. They had some witty comebacks.
Okay.
So I'm not gonna. I much prefer people go watch it than me try to repeat it. But I'll give my best attempt to come up with like the witty comebacks that they did. There were a couple instances where the Magenta Association folks were talking about something, and one of the guys from Typo 3 said something to the effect of, do you think Magenta would be where it is today without open source? Like, do you think if Magenta started as a company that you had to pay a $10,000 license for, that Adobe would have bought it for however much it was purchased for? And the answer from even the Magento Association folks was a clear and resounding no, not a chance. No one would buy Magento because maybe there would be like 5 clients. Right there, there would have been 5 clients. Maybe after several hundred years, it would get up to like 1,000 clients, and that's kind of where it would stop. But open source was a platform for growth, right? It was an opportunity. It was a decision that was made that ended up being a brilliant one. So that led into some further discussions about like where Adobe. One of the things that was skirted around a lot was what's Adobe going to do with the open source framework? Like, what's the roadmap? There was never an answer given, and that was the thing that was kind of like hinted at several times. Vinay was very energetic, and I think I've mentioned several times that what kind of his intents were. He was trying to basically say, now is the time for action.
Totally.
We have a ton of energy in the community. A lot of this has been extraordinarily positive. It's not like people have just been flaming Adobe. There has been some of that, and we're trying to keep it to a minimum.
Right.
I think generally speaking in the community, we are all passionate, sometimes overly outspoken individuals, and I think he's trying to calm some of us down.
Right.
But I think it was mostly a generally positive conversation where basically they said, we'd like to work together, but at the same time, it was a lot of nothing, right? It was just a lot of words.
See, that
wasn't a lot of like, this is the next step.
That was my assumption that it was that was sort of what it was going to be. And I had, I didn't listen to the whole thing, but it kind of confirms what I suspected. I think, like the thing you mentioned where they wanted to know the roadmap and there wasn't really any response from Adobe. That just feels like that's been, again, that just this waiting game just feels like it's been what we've been living through for years. And I'm sure that the people on the Adobe side are kind of just like, again, they have their own incentive structures. They're probably not supposed to talk. They're probably told by somebody, hey, listen, we don't know what's final. Don't talk about it. Right. I'm sure they're not trying to frustrate people. It's probably just like there's a meeting and it's like, hey, let's wait until we make a firm decision before we let this out. And of course, those decisions take longer than expected. And, it's just all regular stuff, I assume. But the net result is that like it's just a stagnation, and like let's get some people that are ready to get some stuff done to just power through. That's
the Typo 3 guys mentioned that their framework, like every framework goes through ups and downs, positive and negatives, people being happy, people being pissed. And they mentioned that there was a period of time where their community was upset at them for, I can't remember precisely the reason, but they got out of it. The way they kind of got out of it was basically by defining a roadmap. So they said, we're not going to give you guys what's coming in every feature or what's coming in every release. We can't know. There's so many possible features that could come that could take too long. That we might not know how to do now. Maybe they're easy, maybe they're hard. We have no idea. But we can give you guys a release timeline. And we can say, okay, we're going to commit to this level of stability for this long. We're going to commit to open source stability for 3 years. And then you can pay us if you want patches for 4 more years after that, right? And he said, by doing that, we alleviated a tremendous amount of the concern in our community that we're going to be leaving you guys hanging at any point in time, and then it's your own problem to deal with it. But that none of that has to say, hey, this new feature for bundled products is coming out next Thursday. There's nothing in there that says like what feature when. It's just simply giving developers the ability to know and plan appropriately. And we have nothing like that. We know, hey, we're going to get 2.4.5, but that doesn't mean breaking changes or not. I have no idea. Like I had a conversation with someone from Adobe last week about this. I'm not going to name any names, but basically kind of came to the conclusion that the current versioning schema of Magenta is stupid because you have like the internal package versioning schema of like 100.0.0 or whatever, and then you have like the marketing version of 2.4.5, and or 2.4.3, 2.4.4. A developer has no idea if there's any breaking changes between 2.4.4, 2.4.3, or 2.4.4. There's no concept. We have no clue.
Yeah.
They could be a bunch of breaking changes or none. We have no idea if there's anything between 2.4.4 and 2.4.5.
Yeah. And what you just said is kind of a perfect microcosm for this whole thing, which is that you had this conversation with somebody from Adobe, not going to name any names because that's sort of how this goes. It's like, somebody on the inside and you kind of, you talk to them about something and then they confirm, that they agree with, like, that's exactly how it should not be happening, right? This stuff should, that conversation, this stuff should all be on GitHub where people are discussing all these things in the open, and people on the Adobe side, or people on the core team, right, should be like having these, I agree with you. You're right. This is bad. This is wrong. And just like getting stuff done, moving things forward, doing architecture out in the open. I just thought it was funny. It was just a perfect little microcosm for it.
It is because, so there's so many little aspects that you can address with that singular statement. And it's funny to me that maybe like the problem can be solved so trivially by enabling GitHub discussions.
Okay.
Just enable discussions on GitHub for the Magenta repo. And by doing so, you're opening a floodgate to public discourse that's not in GitHub issues.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with the discussions feature. Is that relatively new?
I think it's within the past 2 years.
Oh, okay.
But basically it's just a forum on GitHub for that particular repo where people can ask questions. They can be categorized and closed and archived. But the important thing is, one of the things that I find as a negative to Slack and the fact that the Magenta community Slack exists is that it's not searchable.
Right.
So first of all, not only is it not searchable from like Google, I can't like go type in a query into Google and get answers. Right. And as a result, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge lost in Slack.
Totally.
And not only is it not searchable, but also the Slack instance that Magento uses is not paid.
Right.
So you only get like 10,000 messages, which means every like week and a half.
Right. It's all
you
gone.
can't find anything you've ever written before. That's its own problem. But there's no avenue for these kinds of discussions. Periodically, you'll have some Twitter flame where someone will get real mad because a PR hasn't been reviewed.
Right.
But there's no avenue for like, maybe this is maybe the perfect point. I have not seen a GitHub issue describing, "Dear Adobe, we really hate the current PR process. How can we improve it?"
Right.
Because GitHub issues is not the right place for that.
Right. That's a good point.
And while we can have that in Slack, not everyone's going to see it. It's not searchable, so after the fact, you're not going to be able to determine who made the decision and how it was come to.
Yep.
And likely what's going to end up happening anyway is that the Adobe team is going to take that conversation, take it internally, and then they'll give you a response a couple weeks later, and then you're stuck with whatever you get back.
Now, what about the Magento forums? Is that the kind of thing that could happen on the forums in theory?
I don't. You have to log into your like Magento account to use the forums,
it's a
right?
Little, it's a little.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that.
I know, I get it. I think that I think
the forums are
a separate world. Some people I think are using them frequently and getting some value, but others are probably not quite as much. That seems like the kind of thing, the GitHub discussions, that could be, a good place for those types of things to be discussed.
Yeah, as I said, maybe it's like the simplest answer. Maybe I am glossing over it too much. But I think that would be a nice first step to open some engagement.
Right.
And not have my issues closed after 90 days of no activity. Right. Provide an avenue for broader discussions about topics that don't necessarily pertain to a precise line of code.
Right.
Where we feel like we have some operational opportunities in the community to be heard. And that's, I mean, at the end of my article, I say, I hope you take this as an opportunity where we are desperately trying to help you. All that we ask is that you listen.
Right.
And that's, I think, the problem, that we've never been heard.
Right.
The association isn't our voice. We're being talked down to, not necessarily in a derogatory sense, but we're being spoken to. We're not being listened to.
Right.
Spoken at's probably more correct.
Right. And I feel bad I haven't been more involved in the association. I know that, I believe that they will put out questions and get feedback or surveys and things like that. So, I don't know. I don't know if
I think surveys are a mistake. Like, they need to be. If it were me, I would be doing exactly what we're doing right now. We decided to chat. We did whatever this is, and we're talking, right?
Yep.
They're not going door to door. They're not banging on doors and saying, "Hey, devs in Mage Chat," or "Hey, devs in this Discord community, let's talk." Right. Let's have a conversation. Or, "Hey, devs who happen to be in this, I don't know, Brazilian Discord. I don't know, just picking something arbitrary. Let's talk."
Yeah.
There's nothing like that. There's no door to door. There's, "Hey, we're gonna send an email. Please click on some stuff," and it's very impersonal.
Right.
And no one gets listened to. The questions are, you're forced to answer their questions. You don't get to raise your own questions.
Right. Right.
The format's not right. Like this is what I mentioned in my article. No taxation without representation. What we need, and I don't like the idea of a democratically elected governing body. We don't need Congress for Magento. But what we do need is representation of the people that the community members think are appropriate. Like, obviously the guy Sava from Atwix is a good fit, right? He fits well.
Right.
But as I said, I don't know the rest of them. I don't know who they are.
Yeah.
I think there was someone from Snowdog on there, right? I think they have like the alpaca theme.
I think so. Probably Kuba. I want to say.
Yeah.
who, yeah, I mean, again, also great dude, built out a great team, has contributed a ton, a lot of events organization. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where everything goes. I've been a horrible Magento community member. I've been a little out of the loop, but you know,
And
I think I've gotten energized by this. I think in a similar way that a lot of people have. Like, you know, we want to see the Magento community thrive. We just do. You know, um, so it'll be interesting to see where this all goes.
yeah, I've spent the past 7 years of my existence um, contributing, not necessarily just in code, but because really early on I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
But I've been part of conversations. I have contributed PRs. I've contributed GitHub issues. I triage tons of things in Slack. Um, and I would feel awful if all of this effort is just lost for no reason other than operational negligence.
Yeah.
Like it would be sad. And
Yeah.
Willem started off, I don't want to drag this on too much longer, but Willem started off by saying, he got into Magento as a student, and he built his first web shop in Magento for €1,500.
Yep.
The question you might have to ask yourself is, if a merchant comes to you and says, I have €1,500, would you build them anything in Magento?
No, not today, probably.
Right. Not a chance. Because I can pick Shopify, or I can pick BigCommerce,
Right.
or I can pick any other software as a service platform that's going to serve that particular merchant's need precisely.
Right.
And it will make it much easier for them day to day. And that was a decision made by Magento, maybe even while eBay still owned them, to not go the software as a service route, to not build out a software as a service style of Magento for small merchants. And as a result, we are now, several years later, seeing the ramifications of that decision.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they tried with Magento Go, but just kind of didn't quite pull it off. I think it was a little outside of their wheelhouse.
I don't even know what Magento Go is.
Oh.
That's maybe that's either your age or my naivete.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was like a SaaS version of Magento back in, gosh, that was a while ago.
Did it work?
No, it didn't quite work. I'll shoot you a link to it. I'll shoot you a link.
Okay.
But yeah, suffice to say that Magento didn't quite make the leap to SaaS for probably a variety of reasons. But very good, Damien. Well, I should run here in a minute. But anything else we want to cover here? Anything you want to shout out before we wrap it up?
Daffodil, use it. We get to deflect. I mean, obviously, we get to deflect all of this Magento nonsense. So I'll always say that. Daffodil's great. I've enjoyed using it. I've enjoyed writing it. Maybe one day it will have its day in the limelight.
Take over the world.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I'm hoping. Yeah, we have some new stuff coming up. We've done a number of really cool features, but nothing that's particularly noteworthy. A lot of the past year and a half of dev work has been building feature parity, right? So getting back, because whenever you start a Greenlawn thing, you have to get back to parity.
Yep.
And then and only then can you start to innovate. And we've spent the past, 2 or 3 years of dev work getting back to parity with what kind of people experience with Magento. So a lot of it's been nitty-gritty SEO related things.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it's been making sure stuff works. So nothing terribly novel of late. But there's going to be some cool stuff coming up in the future.
Nice, man. Of course, Daffodil is the Angular front end, PWA, and I think it's neat, man, that you just really enjoy working with it. You're plugging away and haven't gotten tired of working on it and doing, all the difficult day-to-day stuff, feature parity and stuff, and are still, having fun with it, man. That's at the end of the day, that's kind of all that matters, that you're enjoying your work, So
Yeah, you gotta grind a little bit. Like I think PWAs suffer in general from people saying, "Hey, there's this new thing called PWAs, come buy it," and then they get the PWA and they're like, "Hey, this has got like 1/7 the features that I had before I had the PWA."
Right.
So it's a lot of trying to just calm myself and say, "Hey, just because they have a feature, or just because they're promoting and putting tons of money into marketing, doesn't mean that you should."
Yeah.
Right? It's not necessarily the best thing to do. I'm not pointing fingers at you, storefront, I promise.
This episode is brought to you by View Storefront.
Okay. That being said, so hit me up on Twitter, Damien at Damien WebDev, LinkedIn, Damien Retzinger. You can find me. I post about all sorts of random shenanigans. And then finally, I will shout out because I did just recently publish my first research paper, actually 2 research papers.
Really?
On COVID-19. Yeah,
so
I did some statistics.
Way. That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I did some stats work. I posted those on LinkedIn.
Wow.
If you search my name and you type in like COVID-19 Damien Retzinger, you're not going to find like my health profile that said I had COVID-19. I didn't. But you will find some interesting articles about some research that I did.
Very interesting. So now, was this like a peer-reviewed paper or?
Yeah, it got peer-reviewed and it's in a journal.
No way.
Actually, it's two different journals. So 2 different papers, 2 different journals.
Which journals? I probably won't know them, but.
Pathogens is an MDPI journal, and then Elsevier has another journal. Forgetting the name of it, but that was more the second. So the first one was kind of a bigger paper, and the second one was an editorial based on the original paper. So the first one is basically like, I don't want to get too far into the research because this is Magenta stuff, but the basic premise is you might ask yourself, why is COVID-19 and the flu and various, why are these kinds of viruses seasonal? Why do they get worse in the winter and better in the summer? And the postulation and the hypothesis is that this is a result of the fact that pollens and mold spores and things actually compete with flu and COVID-19 for binding sites in your lungs. So because during the summer there's more pollen and more mold spores, there's greater competition, and then in the winter there's less.
Wow.
So you'll get more sick in the winter and less sick in the summer as a result of a natural interaction between mold spores and pollens and
that's crazy.
COVID-19 and the flu. And then subsequently to that, I did an editorial which is describing the benefit, because we were able to project a theoretical, we were able to calculate the difference between the actual and theoretical of COVID-19 cases as a result of wearing face masks in Chicago. And we were to actually, because the researchers that we worked with were at Northwestern, they could actually get financial data from Northwestern hospitals in Chicago. So we were actually able to compute how much money, not just, you can compute lives too, but I just wanted to give a kind of a business gauge, but how much money was actually saved by wearing face masks.
Okay.
Because we know the day the mandate went into effect, and we can actually see a sharp drop about 2 weeks later in cases. So I was able to actually calculate the total net money saved from wearing face masks.
Unreal, dude.
In Chicago.
You're a scientist.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man.
I think my Commerce Hero profile says people call me the professor.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, thanks, bud. I'm going to have to check that out, and I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and go ahead and hit us up if you have any questions, comments, cash, or Bitcoin. That's going to be my new closer.